The following program is a special presentation of Train World Television, Channel 711 in Train World City.
Hi, I'm Sandy Maida. What you're about to see is a presentation on the Duluth Works steel mill. Steel mill that was in the area from 1915 to 1979. What you're also about to see is a presentation on the model that it's based on. It is known as the Train World City Steel Works. So I'm glad you stopped by. The presentation is rather informal, but I think you'll enjoy it. Thanks.
On March 2nd, 1901, the United States Steel Corporation was founded in New Jersey. It was the world's first billion-dollar company and the largest company of the world at that time. Besides the steel mills, U.S. Steel also owned its own railroads, fleets of ships, and the quarries and mines from which it got its raw materials to make its steel. In the state of Minnesota, that meant U.S. Steel owned 70% of all the iron ore in the state. The Minnesota State Legislature wanted a manufacturer of products made from its own iron ore to be located here in the state. In January 1907, they proposed a tonnage tax on all ore mined from Minnesota or build a plant in the state. With over 70% of ore consumed from Minnesota, this threat was aimed clearly at United States Steel. U.S. Steel saw the writing on the wall and quickly made arrangements to build a mill in the state of Minnesota. After scouting sites, it eventually landed in the city of Duluth. On April 2nd, 1907, Duluthians awoke to the news that a monster steel plant, costing between $5 and $6 million, would be built here. In June of that same year, the Minnesota Steel Company, a wholly owned subsidiary of U.S. Steel, was formed. The officers of the Minnesota Steel Company all held executive positions in United States Steel, yet their headquarters was located in a humble structure near the mill entrance. Early plans of the mill show a sprawling, massive complex of almost 50 buildings. These plans changed from time to time, but the overall plans remain the same. The eventual plans for the mill included the steel mill itself, the connecting railroad lines, the cement plant, and the innovatively planned company town of Morgan Park. Originally named Model City, Morgan Park was named for U.S. Steel's chairman of the board, J.P. Morgan. Construction on the city started in 1913. As a company town, U.S. Steel ran the whole show. Only employees of U.S. Steel and its subsidiaries could live there. On March 30th of 1914, the first residents arrived. The heart of Morgan Park's commercial district centered around a building that was known as the Lakeview Store. Rather than have individual shops located throughout the town, all of the shops were located in one building. This made the Lakeview Store among the very first indoor malls in America. If you'd like to learn more about Morgan Park itself, please pick up Arnold R. Allenen's fantastic book titled Morgan Park, Duluth, U.S. Steel, and the Forging of a Company Town. Even though plans for the mill were announced in 1907, actual work at the plant did not start until July of 1910, by which time plans for the mill had risen to $10 million. By September of 1910, the upper deck of the Oliver Bridge was finished, a vital link in the Interstate Transfer Railway, a railway which connected the mill to the docks in Eloise of Superior. On the Minnesota side, work was being completed on the Duluth, Mesabi, and Northern Railroad's Spirit Lake Transfer Railway, which came from Adolph to Steelton Yard in Gary and brought the vital iron ore down from the Iron Range. At the same time, work was being completed at the plant site to include excavations for sewers, some so large that they were described as canals. The earliest structures at the mill included storehouses, warehouses, a machine shop, and a construction powerhouse. A concrete mixer was also built. This mixer actually built the buildings of the steel mill and Morgan Park. Contrary to popular belief, it was this mixer, and not the cement plant, that built the mill and Morgan Park, as the cement plant had not yet been built. Located off of Steelton Yard, this mixer was eventually torn down after its use was no longer needed. To power the concrete mixer and the early structures at the mill, a construction powerhouse was created, in which it was installed two 400 horsepower boilers, a 500 kilowatt generator, and a cross-compound engine. With the powerhouse now up and running, work began on the foundations and initial structures of the mill. This included the foundations of the open hearth, the soaking pits, and the rolling mills, and the blast furnaces. Work proceeded on the mill in all months, even the winter, and by July 1913, the money spent at the Duluth mill was now at $20 million. U.S. steel officials were overly concerned with Duluth's weather. Most of the steel plant buildings were built of concrete instead of corrugated steel, as was normal in practice. This construction practice allowed air to pass between the walls of the mill, keeping it warm in the winter and cool in the summer. Many of the structures at the mill were built by U.S. Steel subsidiary American Bridge Company, including the open hearth. The smokestacks, built of concrete, were done by the William Kellogg Company. The use of large amounts of concrete at the mill attracted the attention of many mechanical and technical engineers and brought them to the Duluth mill to study its construction, which was revolutionary at the time. By 1914, it appeared the mill was about ready to be finished. However, events in Europe would change all of that. In August of 1914, World War I breaks out, and no major work would be done on the mill for 8 months. Work resumed on the mill in March of 1915. Construction was hurried to complete the mill so that it could contribute to the war effort as soon as possible. The Pennsylvania Engineering Works of Newcastle, Pennsylvania were contracted to build Duluth's unique twin blast furnaces, the construction of which required 6,000 tons of steel. The blast furnaces at Duluth were very unique. The top of each stove's offtakes were all combined to create one stack. The Duluth furnaces were instantly recognizable for this feature. Another unusual feature of the blast furnaces was that the skip house and underground ore bins were all enclosed, also in the concrete structure. Although it was started later, work commenced simultaneously on the nearby and adjacent Universal Cement Plant. The cement plant made concrete and cement by using the byproduct slag, which was produced in the blast furnaces as a byproduct. In August of 1915, the first coal and limestone was shipped to the mill, and thereafter 150 carloads daily of coal was needed at the mill. In October of 1915, this coal produced the first coke in the plant's coke ovens. In November of 1915, the first iron ore arrived. All in all, the mill was nearing completion. As the year 1915 was coming to a close, work on the mill was also nearing completion. Trade journalists and periodicals were calling the new Duluth mill the finest and most technologically advanced mill in the world. Minor technical problems hindered the new steelworkers, but by December 1st of 1915, the first pig iron was produced in the number 1 blast furnace. 10 days later, the first heat of steel was produced in the open hearth. This first steel made was completed as billets and then shipped to the Gary Works on December 15, 1915. Although it was the first commercially produced steel made in Duluth, it was not the first steel made in the city. Less than a mile away, in what is today's Riverside neighborhood, along a rail that fed Minnesota Steel, sat the experimental Ironton Structural Steel Company. In a strange twist of irony, this mill had a small, crude 25-ton open hearth furnace, which produced the first steel in 1892. This steel was shaped into one beam, called the Duluth beam, and later the Gray beam after inventor Henry Gray. Gray took his idea to U.S. Steel President Charles Schwab. The Finance Committee turned Henry Gray down, and Schwab resigned as president of U.S. Steel in 1903, buying the controlling interests in fledgling Bethlehem Steel, and became its first president. With the Duluth beam as Bethlehem's newest product, they became U.S. Steel's chief competitor and rival, and Henry Gray's Duluth-born beam built many of the skyscrapers and structures in this country. A strange irony, born of steel, made here in Duluth. Meanwhile, back at Minnesota Steel, the #1 blast furnace, the only furnace that was operating when the mill first started, made approximately 500 tons of raw pig iron a day. This pig iron was sent in 60-ton hot metal cars to either a pig machine caster or the open hearth furnace building to be converted into steel. On February 19, 1916, the second blast furnace, #2, was blown in. This gave the Duluth plant a capacity of 1,000 tons of pig iron a day. Just 1 week later, on February 26th, the Blooming Mill engine, a 20,000 horsepower steam-driven engine, was knocked out of commission. However, steel was still produced, and ingots were stockpiled until April of 1916, when the engine was repaired and the Blooming Mill was put back into operation. As the steel mill began its early operations, work was still proceeding on the nearby Universal Atlas cement plant. Delays in receiving machinery caused the opening of the cement mill to be delayed. However, on February 26th, the first cement was made. The Universal Cement Plant consumed 600 tons of blast furnace slag daily, 800 tons of limestone, and 200 tons of coal to put out 16,000 sacks of Portland cement daily. This Portland cement was the first made in the state of Minnesota. In June of 1916, the merchant mill was finally completed. Minnesota Steel could now produce semi-finished and finished products made right here in Duluth. By the end of 1916, Minnesota Steel now employed 1,800 workers, 400 at Universal Cement. The steel plant was producing 1,200 tons of pig iron a day and 243,000 tons of finished products a year. Universal Cement was producing 4,000 barrels of cement a day for 710,000 barrels of cement a year. The original market for the Duluth plant was a 12-state area located west of the Mississippi River. It was to furnish this area with semi-finished steel products. However, with war raging in Europe, in May of 1916, the entire output of the Minnesota Steel Company was bought for the war in Europe. Optimism was so high for war production that in September of 1916, the United States Navy considered building and operating an $11 million heavy armor plant using Morgan Park's steel output as its base product. However, this never came to realization. In fact, U.S. Steel purchased more land than it needed to build the plant on purpose. It was thought that other users of its steel would build plants on the 1,500-acre site. Unfortunately, this never occurred, and the only other major tenant was the Universal Atlas cement plant. The Minnesota Steel Company was the largest steel mill west of the Mississippi River. Workers came here from all over, mostly from Europe. However, African Americans, Scots, Greeks, Italians, Slovaks, and all other kinds of people came here to Duluth to work in the mill, creating another melting pot. Following the profitable and heady times of World War I, Minnesota Steel slipped into sort of a recession, which also included a strike in 1919. The strike was nationwide, but it did not affect the workers here at the Duluth mill. What did affect workers here at the mill was a lack of demand for the Minnesota Steel products, which caused rumors of a shutdown or possibly even closing the new plant. Company officials at U.S. Steel were now very concerned with what to do with the new Minnesota Steel Company to make it profitable. One of the problems the Duluth plant faced was that it was located far from centers of industrial development and heavy users of steel. In conjunction with this distance was U.S. Steel's Pittsburgh Plus pricing system, which charged a customer a shipping price as if the product originated in Pittsburgh and not Morgan Park. This added a phantom price to a product made in Duluth, sold to a customer in Duluth, but charged freight as if it was made and shipped from Pittsburgh. Another problem was that its original 12-state western marketing area didn't expand as quickly as hoped, and Minnesota Steel's new rail mill was converted from producing rails to billets, a semi-finished product which didn't produce as high a profit as finished rails. With well over $25 million expended at its new mill and facing another staggering iron ore tax from the Minnesota State Legislature, in 1919, U.S. Steel decided to expand its Morgan Park operations to focus its output on small plates, shapes, bars, and rods. Most importantly, in 1922, it would build a massive new wire mill to produce finished wire products such as barbed wire, fencing, and nails. Opening in July of 1922, the new wire mill was a massive structure. In fact, its output was so large that 12% of all wire made in the United States came from Morgan Park. Its 572 employees made 21,000 miles of wire a year and 150 million different nails a week. Although the plant was the Minnesota Steel Company, these products were sold under the American Steel and Wire Company, another subsidiary of U.S. Steel. These new products sold well, and the Duluth plant churned out a variety of products including fence posts, galvanized wire, woven wire, 300 different types of nails, and springs. In fact, 70% of all valve springs made by American automobile manufacturers were made right here in Morgan Park. By 1927, the nail mill was running at full capacity and fencing and fence posts were selling well. In addition, the Duluth Merchant Mill was making signposts for the expanding American highway system. With its products selling well, U.S. Steel officials were now more at ease with the previous heavy investment in their plant. By 1929, the demand for wire was at the heaviest in company history. Minnesota Steel was running at 100%, and U.S. Steel was planning on expanding the merchant mill and wire mill operations at its Morgan Park plant. Things were looking prosperous in Morgan Park, but an event to unfold in the fall of '29 would bring production at Minnesota Steel and America to a screeching halt. As the Roaring '20s came to a close, Minnesota Steel's newfound success was dashed when the stock market crashed in October of 1929. Hundreds of steelworkers in Morgan Park were instantly laid off. In Duluth, unemployment was among the highest in the nation per capita at almost 27% of its population. While the steel plant went cold, the now newly merged Universal Atlas Cement Company remained intermittently active as Minnesota State repaving program kept the cement plant in production. With U.S. Steel facing record losses, it decided to merge the Minnesota Steel Company into another subsidiary, American Steel and Wire, in May 1932. As the early 1930s of the Depression waned on, sporadic orders at Morgan Park kept some of the mills operating off and on. In a significant event in 1935, one of the two twin blast furnaces was dismantled. It was said to be both obsolete and uneconomically located, a strange admission for a furnace that was just 25 years old at a plant that was considered the most technologically advanced in the world when it opened. Another significant event occurred in March of 1936 when Morgan Park became publicly available to anybody not working for U.S. Steel to live there. In August of that year, the steel and cement plants were finally unionized, as American Steelworkers Union 1028 and United Cement Workers Union 1210 were formed. With war raging once again in Europe, the Morgan Park plant began to come back to life, and was operating now at near capacity by 1939. With another war looming on the horizon, the Duluth Works was back to work. Even before the bombs dropped on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Duluth Union and company officials were lobbying U.S. Steel to build another blast furnace to replace the one dismantled during the Depression. With the United States now officially at war, U.S. Steel dismantled two 1904-era blast furnaces and transported one to Ironton, Utah, and the other to Duluth to increase pig iron production for the war effort. These blast furnaces came from the former iron and steel works in Joliet, Illinois. By 1942, with the addition of the newly refurbished blast furnace, Duluth's annual steel output doubled from 300,000 to 655,000 tons of steel a year. With a sizable portion of Duluth's male workforce drafted for military service, women joined the war effort by working in the Duluth steel plant. Over 500 of the mill's 3,500 employees were women during the war, and they performed every task from shoveling dolomite and drawing wire to operating cranes and inspecting steel. The Duluth Works set a staggering 81 production records in 1943, and 2 years later was bestowed the prestigious Army-Navy E Production Award. This award was given to manufacturing units whose efforts significantly contributed to the war effort. Less than 4% of all production units in the United States received this award. During the war, another significant event occurred in 1943 when U.S. Steel sold its Morgan Park homes to the John Galbraith Company, bringing an end to U.S. Steel's paternal hold on the town. Morgan Park, officially, was a company town no more. With the ending of World War II in 1945, men returned to their normal jobs at the steel plant as the women workforce was phased out. With most of the rest of the world bombed into oblivion, the United States steel industry went straight into peacetime production to rebuild the war-torn countries of the world. The Morgan Park steel plant was no exception. Improvements to the Morgan Park plant following World War II led to increased production, now topping 915,000 tons of steel a year. The open hearth furnaces were upgraded, including two new big 250-ton furnaces, making all 10 of the plant's open hearth furnaces now operational. The original 90 coke ovens were upgraded as well, and additional ovens were added, bringing the total to 115. With the Korean War came other additions to the plant. In 1955, a new mill was built in the former cooperage shop that made welded wire mesh for highway construction. This new product sold very well at the Duluth Works. In the fall of 1956, a 2-day open house allowed the public to tour the Duluth steel plant. Workers painted and polished up the mill for this event, which was to celebrate the 125th anniversary of wire manufacturing in America. Over 51,000 people toured the plants, not knowing that this would be the last time the mill would be open to the public. As the heydays of the 1950s kept forging on, both the steelworkers' unions and the company execs wanted a taste of the record profits being made, and there were several strikes in the decade, the most notable being the 116-day strike of 1959. While steelworkers claimed a labor victory, the work stoppage allowed foreign steel to enter the United States on a considerable scale for the very first time. This dumping of foreign steel would be one of the root causes for the eventual decline of the American steel industry and the closing of the Morgan Park plant. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, U.S. Steel upgraded several of its bigger plants with new basic oxygen furnace technology and continuous casting. This newer technology would replace the rapidly antiquated open hearth furnace technology. Whereas the open hearth could make steel on an average of 10 hours, the new BOF process could do it in 1. While other mills began receiving the new BOF plants, the Duluth Works was never upgraded. As the market fluxed, so did the Duluth Works. It sometimes operated with both blast furnaces and 7 of the 10 open hearths when conditions warranted. It also sometimes operated with only one blast furnace and 3 open hearths. Employees also ranged from 1,500 to 3,000. In 1964, the American Steel and Wire Division, the Duluth plant's parent division within U.S. Steel, was dissolved, and the Duluth Works essentially became an extension of the Chicago area's operations division. Even though it no longer fell under American Steel and Wire, the Duluth Works continued to make wire products here, but those products only consumed 25% of its own steel. It shipped the rest semi-finished steel to Waukegan, Joliet, or Gary for further finishing, a costly process in poor economic times and one that would eventually catch U.S. Steel's watchful eye. With taconite essentially replacing raw iron ore as a raw material in most blast furnaces, the Duluth Works received numerous contracts to supply mines with grinding rods, which the Duluth plant furnished with superior quality as its own blast furnaces still used raw iron ore. Despite these contracts, the Duluth Works' antiquity and market situation were not improving. By the late 1960s, another concern was about to be addressed. The growing outcry over pollution output at large steel mills began to become an issue. The aging Duluth Works was not equipped with modern anti-pollution devices, and installing them would have knowingly cost U.S. Steel millions of dollars. In 1968, the newly created Minnesota Pollution Control Agency began cracking down on newly enacted state pollution laws, and it sent U.S. Steel a memo requesting its pollution output at the Duluth Works and what it intended to do about it within 3 years. While U.S. Steel gathered its data, in 1971 the United Steelworkers threatened a strike. While this threat created temporary increased production, it eventually left end users fully stockpiled with steel. With the threat of a strike, foreign steel dumping, an outmoded facility, a mill that was only a marginal performer, the threat of installing costly pollution controls, and a steel mill that U.S. Steel just didn't really want in the first place, in November of 1971, United States Steel decided to close the hot side of the Duluth Works. The hot side included the blast furnaces, the open hearth furnaces, the pig iron caster, the soaking pit furnaces, and the blooming mill. 1,600 steelworkers were given their pink slips as the city's largest employer began to close shop. 700 employees continued to work using broad-end steel in the rolling mills and the wire mills. The Minnesota State Legislature quickly tried to offer U.S. Steel tax incentives if it would modernize its Duluth mill, an offer that U.S. Steel balked at when in January of '72, Edwin H. Gott said that the hot side of the Duluth Works would never again reopen. While U.S. Steel pledged to keep the rolling mills, coke plant, and cement plant operating, that pledge was short-lived when in July of 1973, U.S. Steel officials decided to close the cold side. 700 employees, the bulk of the remaining Duluth Works labor force, were out of a job. The next unit to close, in September of 1975, was the Universal Atlas Cement Plant, and with it another 160 jobs. This facility probably should have closed earlier, as the main ingredient needed for its cement, slag, was no longer being made when the hot side closed. Lastly, in May 1979, U.S. Steel announced it was finally closing the coke plant. After 65 years, the city's largest employer had finally closed shop. The economic impact felt in Duluth was a gut punch, as while the once mighty steel mill was slowly being demolished through the 1980s, the majority of Duluth's other longtime businesses closed or left the area, such as Diamond Tool, Clyde Iron Works, and the Duluth U.S. Air Force Base. As Duluth joined the ever-growing Rust Belt of the 1970s and 80s, other once seemingly impregnable mills met the wrecking ball, including Johnstown, Fairless, Geneva, Youngstown, Homestead, Southworks, Aliquippa, Steubenville, Newcastle, Waukegan, Joliet, and a host of other once mighty steel mills, all closed in the trying economic times. Beginning in 1984, the Duluth Works site was placed on the Superfund list, a list of polluted industries that needed to be cleaned up. The former Duluth Works steel plant site and cement plant site became an industrial park, and New Hallett Wire even made wire here until 1987, when it became the last formal tenant at the Duluth Works. In 1988, the raising of the mill began, and by 1997, virtually nothing remained of this once sprawling complex. Over the 50 buildings that once dotted the site, virtually nothing remains today of the complex that once called itself the Duluth Works. The Duluth Works model is in reality the Train World City Steelworks, a fictional steelworks that resides in a fictional country in a fictional city in Lake Superior. It's situated at one corner of the layout, which is an HO scale, static, outdoor seasonal layout. The Republic of Train World is a fictional country, which is also a fictional island in Lake Superior during the era of the early 1950s. The capital city of the Republic of Train World is known as Train World City, and although there are many cities on the island, it is only this city that you will see in the layout. The city layout is quite massive and is actually formed in three sections, one which is the city, one which is the rail yard, and one which is the steel plant. While the city itself is fictional, many of the buildings and models on the layout are modeled after actual buildings in the city of Duluth, including the Tapakeg Inn, where smelt is served year-round. The St. George Serbian Orthodox Church in Duluth is also modeled, ironically, the same location which this presentation is taking place in. On Train World City's own Raleigh Street sits replicas of the famed North Pole Bar and Ray's Grill, once long fixtures in the Raleigh Street neighborhood of West Duluth. Directly across the street from the North Pole Bar on Train World City's Raleigh Street sits the South Pole, owned by Willie B. Penguin. Since I have an admiration for penguins, you will find them distributed throughout the city on the layout. You will also find 5 of them on the Train World City Steelworks layout on the exhibit. West Duluth's own Iconics headquarters building is also modeled on the layout, although it is known as Adama Industries, an aviation manufacturer based on the character in Battlestar Galactica. Every town has a movie theater, and Train World City is certainly no exception, with this one being the Savalas Starlighter Theater, named for Telly Savalas, who lived in Duluth during the 1980s. You can even find Telly Savalas driving around in his 1974 Buick squad car as Lieutenant Theo Kojak on the layout. Train World City's media buildings sit in 2 structures, one which houses the Train World Tribune, which is Train World City's newspaper. The other, known as the Donovan Building, houses TWRS Radio and TWTV Television, the fictional television station which is promoting this very program. The high school in Train World City is known as Train World City Robert Boyott Memorial High School, which was named for my grandfather, a longtime Duluth educator and principal in the Duluth Public Schools. This building was modeled after Duluth Central High School, Duluth Denfeld High School, and Irving Elementary School in Duluth. Every now and then, you can even catch a group of the neighborhood kids playing sandlot baseball at Boyott High School's Sandlot Field. Train World City in itself is certainly a unique model layout, but the heart and soul that feeds the city is the Train World City Steelworks, and we like to show you that next. The Train World City Steelworks is an HO scale, outdoor, static, seasonal model based on the Duluth Works of United States Steel. Much like the prototype that it is based on, the Duluth Works, the Train World City Steelworks is a massive, sprawling complex of over 50 buildings on model layout. Although it is based on the Duluth Works of U.S. Steel, the Train World City Steelworks is not a perfect replica of the former Duluth Works steel plant. There are several key differences between the two. Due to size constraints, the 115 coke ovens at the Duluth Works were not able to be replicated at the Train World City Steelworks. Instead, because of those size constraints, there are only 46, built between 2 Walthers kits. It was decided to replicate the original Morgan Park blast furnace and the Joliet furnace of U.S. Steel's Duluth Works. This was done using a milk jug as a base for the scratch-built furnace and a Walters kit for the Joliet furnace. The Walters kit was kit-bashed to form the Joliet furnace, while the Morgan Park furnace was completely scratch-built, all by hand. There were several structures at the Duluth Works that were not modeled for this exhibit on the Trainwell City Steelworks, including the wire mill, the machine shops, and several of the railroad buildings. In addition, the coke plant byproducts buildings were not modeled either. With the elimination of the wire mill and machine shops from the layout, the ore bridge cranes were moved closer to the open hearth, and a boat slip was actually put in its place. This boat slip was once proposed for the Duluth Works, but was never actually built, and it was built here on the layout for the Trainwell City Steelworks. The SS Carl Utah is a scratch-built ore carrier, and it is named for my great-grandfather, Carl Utah, who actually sailed and sadly died on the Great Lakes. The Utah sails for the Chippewa Star Transportation Company, a fictional company that is a play on the Columbia Star Transportation Company of Ogilvy Norton, which famously sailed the Edmund Fitzgerald. The first officer of the Utah is Captain Ken Tardy, my uncle, another Great Lakes mariner. His first officer is Ken Risch, a good friend of his and his brother-in-law, and again, my uncle. Another of the fictional companies on the layout is the TCR, otherwise known as the Trainwell and Chippewa Range Railroad, a direct play on the DM&IR, or the Duluth-Mesabi and Iron Range. Imagery is not lost in that the TCR uses a tomahawk instead of the arrowhead as its main emblem. The TCR services the Trainwell City Steelworks. The TCR is not the only fictional railroad. The Mahina Coal and Chemical Company also runs a fictional train to the Trainwell City Steelworks and delivers its coal. This railroad gets its name from my sister Chrissy, who actually coined the term Mahina as the ultimate word for anything, and I decided to use it as a play in this layout. The Frostbite Falls Railroad is also another fictional railroad that is often seen on the layout. It is named directly for the Rocky and Bullwinkle town of Frostbite Falls. While there are many fictional railroads, there's actually a lot of real railroads on Trainwell City itself, including the Sioux Line, the Duluth, Winnipeg and Pacific, the Canadian National, and the Great Northern, to name a few. While it is actually located closer to the Duluth Steel Mill than it is on the Trainwell City Steelworks, the Universal Atlas Cement Plant is also modeled here in Trainwell City, although the model was not done for this exhibit. Even with these changes, we believe the Trainwell City Steelworks looks very much like the Duluth Works and serves well in its capacity. It is not a perfect replica, but we believe it's one that serves it justice. On June 25th and 26th of 2016, the Duluth Works, aka the Trainwell City Steelworks model, went on public exhibit for the very first time in the lower hall of the St. George Serbian Orthodox Church. Setup of the model began the day before the exhibit at 11 o'clock in the morning and proceeded all day and did not finish until 3 o'clock in the morning the very day the exhibit opened. The model was transported from Cloquet to Duluth's Gary neighborhood for presentation by my father and myself, and set up by three principal people, myself, Jeremy Polson, and Roger Nesji. Final details were put in place very early in the morning before the exhibit opened, but at 10 in the morning on 25th of June, the exhibit was open to the public. The model layout fit on several tables, and it stretched for 20 feet long by almost 6 feet wide. Signs for both the Duluth Works and the Trainwell City Steelworks were included in the exhibit, and one existed at the Morgan Park entrance and the Gary entrance. Several everyday elements were used on the layout to create some authenticity. This included coffee grounds, flour, Play-Doh for hot metal, and regular sand. Charcoal from a grill was actually grated down to use as coal, and actual ore from the Duluth Works steel plant was used in the ore yard. Additional effects were created by using cotton from pillows to use as steam and smoke from the quench towers and smokestacks, while hot metal itself was created by using Play-Doh and stretching it to fit the bill. Coffee grounds were painted and used to fill the cargo hold of the ore boat Carl Utaug. While to the casual observer the blast furnaces appeared finished, they were in fact not, even though work was rushed to complete them before the exhibit. They were hurriedly constructed and put together to just make it appear as if they were in fact functional. As stated earlier in this program, I have an admiration for penguins, since I work at a zoo, and I hid no less than 10 of them in plain sight on the layout, and I challenged the visitors to find them. Some found them, and some didn't. From the time it opened to the time it wrapped, several hundred people toured the Duluth Works exhibit. They ranged from children to families of steelworkers to former steelworkers to model railroaders. The exhibit was quite the success, and the saddest thing about it was that eventually we had to tear it down. But not before telling the story of the Duluth Works steel mill, at least in model form, and for that I am eternally thankful for those who came.
Hi, welcome back. The story of the Duluth steel mill, as you can see, it wasn't really born of economics. It was actually born of politics between the state of Minnesota and U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel never wanted to build a mill here in the first place, but it was the price they had to pay in order to keep good relations with the state of Minnesota for not imposing iron ore taxes. But the story of the Duluth Works doesn't end there. It actually begins there, because without the Duluth Works, most of the people that we are today, third, fourth, fifth generation, wouldn't be here. So it's an important story to tell, and one that I'm very proud to tell you. So I want to thank you for watching this presentation, and thanks for coming along.
This has been a special presentation of Train World Television, Channel 711 in Train World City. We hope you enjoyed this program. Thanks for watching.